Morning. Okay, yesterday we spoke about the koi, kvi. Okay, so we had a scenario where there were 9 people. Each one of them accepted Nazir based on whether the kvi is considered a domesticated animal or a wild animal. And the Mishnah says basically everybody is a Safek Nazir. And we spoke about yesterday the Chiddush of the Mishnah. What's the new idea here is that until now we spoke about the famous Rav Shimon's opinion, Rav Shimon of Krei. What does Rav Shimon say? That if a guy accepts a Nazirus that turns out to be a Safek Nazirus, the Nazirus is valid. So he pointed out that, one second. We pointed out that so for example, somebody has a big pile of wheat, and he says, I should be a Nazir if there are 100 measurements of wheat in here. And then the pile gets burnt or lost, and nobody knows how much measurements were inside. So in that scenario, had you went ahead and measured, you would be a Nazir Vadai if there were 100 measurements, or you wouldn't be a Nazir at all if there were not 100 measurements. However, now that it's a Safek, you become a Safek Nazir. In this scenario of Kvi, there's no way to verify the Safek because this is sort of a long-standing debate. What is the status of Kvi? Whether it's an animal or whether it is a domesticated animal, whether it's a wild animal. Okay. And therefore, despite the fact that it's an unresolvable Safek, everybody still remains a Safek Nazir. Okay, we're at the Gemara on 34a, toward the bottom of the page. Tani Chada, we learned in a Brisa, Tisha Nazirim. There were 9 Nazirim, which is exactly the scenario of the Mishnah. There were 9 people. One guy said, if it's a wild animal, if it's not a wild animal, if it's an animal, if it's domesticated, if it's not domesticated, that it's wild and domesticated, it's neither wild nor domesticated, that's 6. That one of you are a Nazir, 7. That none of you are Nazir is 8. That all of you are Nazirim is 9. Okay. The Tanya Idach, another bright said, Tesha Naziriyais. He becomes a Nazir 9 times. Okay, Bishlem Tisha Nazirim, the scenario of Kvi that results in 9 people becoming Nazirim, that makes sense. Going to have a Gavri Tfei, there were 9 different people, the Itfis, each one, V'ozabay, exactly like our Mishnah, each one made one of these statements. El Tesha Naziriyas L'chad Gavri Hechem Mishgachasla. How is it possible for one person to become 9 Naziriyas based on these statements? So, in other words, the first few are possible. The guy says, right, the guy could say, I should be Nazir if it's an animal, if it's wild, if it's not wild, if it's domesticated, if it's not domesticated, if it's wild and domesticated, if it's domesticated, if it's neither domesticated nor wild. Okay, that's 6. But the remaining statements, I should be Nazir if any of you are Nazir, it doesn't make any sense. Or if all of you are Nazir, it doesn't either make sense. The first 6, like we said in our Mishnah, like what we just said, that makes sense. But the remaining 3, how is that possible? So Amar Rav Sheshes says, simple. Amar, he says, Hareini Nazir Unazirus Hakol Alai. He sees the 9 people are lining up to make these statements about the Kfi. So he says, I'm accepting 1 Nazirus for all these 9 people. So there you have it. He becomes a Nazir 9 times. Okay, next parak, Shleshaminim. Now we get a little bit practical here. Okay, so since I think this actually is interesting, I think there's one of the podcasts, maybe it was Stefanski on Daf. He interviewed a Nazir. Interesting discussion. Okay, anyway, Shleshaminim Asur ben Nazir. There are 3 things that are prohibited to a Nazir, and they are Hatumah, to become Tamei, Hatagalachas, to cut his hair, Vahayotzim and a Geffen, or to eat anything that comes out of a grape. Geffen here is more of a vine. Okay. So those are the 3 rules of Nazir. Additionally, the Kol Hayotzim and a Geffen mitzvah from Zemzeh. So we said it's anything that comes out of a vine, which means that it could be grapes, it could be wine, and we'll soon see it includes pits and peels as well. So let's say a guy eats a combination of pits, peels, and grapes for kazayas. That's perfectly acceptable. It also includes, by the way, wine vinegar, or sala, or wine vinegar. Both those are wine products. As a matter of fact, the Torah specifically includes them. Yeah.
Rabbi, what about if it's included as a component, let's say, in fertilizer or something like that, commercial-wise, which I could see happening?
That'll be okay. So that'll be an interesting question. You're talking about well,
You're not eating.
you're not eating it, right? You're not eating it.
Well, you're not eating it strictly
It's
speaking,
tomatoes.
but it is going
That's
into the
fine.
production of something you will eat, and
That's
in the
fine.
sense it's being integrated into it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That'd be
Alright.
fine. It's only
I'll sleep better now.
light
Okay,
consumption.
that one was keeping me up all night, by the way.
Well, you don't have.
Well,
very-
now you can rest peacefully.
If that's your only problem, you're in good shape.
Yeah, not much of a life, I know. It's a little scary. Oh, well.
Okay. So they all combine. So if the guy's eating grapes, he needs to eat the minimum quantity of grapes to be considered eating, which is a kazayas. Okay. The top of Lamadal on the base, 34b. Okay. Mishnah Rishona Emeres at Sheyishna Revius Yayin. The first version of the Mishnah was that he needs to drink a revius of wine. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, initially, when the rabbis taught this Gemara, they said that you have to drink specifically a revius of wine. In other words, if you're drinking, it's going to be drinking a revius of wine. In other words, the consumption of wine is going to be through drinking. So obviously, the Torah specifically says grapes, pits, peels, etc. However, if you're going to be drinking grape juice or wine as a beverage, so then the only way to be liable is to drink one revius of it. How much is revius? Well, it's 3 to 5 ounces, roughly speaking, whatever it is. Okay. Rabbi Kiva says, no, there's another possibility too. So that was the initial version of the Mishnah. Rabbi Kiva says no. He clarifies. He says, if he dipped his bread into the wine, and there's enough bread in there that he's eating a kazayas of bread soaked in wine, that also makes him liable. Okay.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, can I ask for page position, please?
Yes, we are on 34b, and we are 3 lines down. Okay. If you drink just wine, that's fine. That you violate a prohibition. If you eat just grapes, also violation. But moreover, if you eat just peels, you eat grape peels, you go to the winery, you just ask for the peels, and you eat the peels. Or you eat just the pits, the seeds at the same time, whatever, each on its own, that alone is enough to be chayev. Rabbi Dovid Yehudah has this unique idea. Ein chayev, he's not liable. Shnei chartzanim v'zag, two peels and a pit. Okay, the Gemara says, well, what does chartzan and what does zag mean? Elohen chartzanim, this is our chartzan, ve'elohen zagim, and these are zag. Chartzanim, elo hachitzanim, that's the outside. Obviously, it's what we call the peel. Hazagin, elo hapnimim. When the Torah calls something zagim, Torah is talking about the pits. Okay. Div Rabbi Yehudah, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. However, there's a disagreeing opinion here. Rabbi Yossi, you shouldn't make a mistake. It's the opposite. Kazug shel behema, like a person who's plowing with the pure of animals. Hachitzain, the outer one is called zug, and the panimi, the inside one, is called invel. Okay, so therefore, the opinion of Rabbi Yossi actually is the opposite. Charitzin is a pit, zag is a peel. But until now, obviously, the traditional explanation we saw is the opposite. Charitzin is a peel, zag is a pit. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Let's begin the Gemara. Shloisha minim asurim b'nazir. three things are prohibited. Nazir or Tumah. Okay. Hayotzim min gefen in gefen atzma loy. Specifically, the products of a vine. What are the products of a vine? The fruit and its associated possibilities. So whether it's grapes or grape juice or wine vinegar, that all of that is considered products of the fruit. What about there's a Sephardic food, very common Middle Eastern. It's they eat rice wrapped in grape leaves. Can a Nazir eat grape leaves? Now, I'm not very familiar with Sephardic culture, but the Gemara here refers to another item, sort of the grapevine. There are the branches; those are called zmoros. Then there are sort of softer, like twine or softer, like branches that aren't stiff, that apparently can also be eaten. So the Gemara says our Mishnah only lists items that are they're fruit related. Right, so the pits are part of the fruit, the peels are part of the fruit, the vinegar comes from the fruit, the grape juice, wine comes from the fruit, etc. Okay, but what about eating the tree itself? Our mission does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Lazar. The Tanya we learn, or 3 lines in the Gemara on 34b. The Tanya we learn, Rabbi Lazar says, "Afilu olin v'lulovin b'mashma." Even leaves and sort of these soft branches are included in the prohibition. A Nazir is not only prohibited from the fruit of the tree, he's also prohibited from the tree itself, the leaves and sort of the soft branches. And we'll soon see that the stiff branches called zmoros, those the Nazir is not prohibited. The Nazir is permitted to eat zmoros. Okay, 1 second. Ikeda Amrila, some say Aseifa. We're going here on the conclusion. 1 second. So in this version, the diuk, the potential source. So the beginning of the mission says hayotzim min hagafen, something that leaves the grape. So that indicates to us the Mishnah says only something that leaves the product of a vine, and not the vine itself. Whereas the second version of the same Gemara indicates the source is the end of the Mishnah. He eats from the fruit of the tree, from the grape, a kazayas. Min ha'anovim in, specifically from the grapes or the grape products, and we'll explore that in more detail soon. But mehagefen atzmai, but eating from the tree itself, loy, that is not included. Okay, so Gemara says, "Masisni like Rabbi Lazar." Our mission is clearly not like Rabbi Lazar. The Tanya we learned, Rabbi Lazar Omer, afilu olin v'lulovim b'mashma. Even the leaves and the branches are included. The branches obviously are the soft branches. B'mashma. Okay. What's the debate here? This is where we introduced yesterday. Rabbi Lazar Dorish Ribuye Umi Ute, Rabbanan Darshi Kloli Uprati. There's a debate about how you use the framework of a specific followed by a generalization. And that's what we'll begin to explore. Rabbi Eliezer Dorish Ribuye Umi Ute. Rabbi Eliezer understands the Torah, the categorization of the Torah to be the rule of Ribuy and Miyot, more inclusive and less inclusive. Just give me a moment here. Okay, so if you have the full verse on the side of the page and you want to see it in the art scroll, in the newer versions of the art scroll at least, it's in the Torah Ora Shalom by the Aleph on the left hand bottom side of the page. So the verse states, "Miyayin v'sheichar yazer." He is prohibited with yayin. Sheichar is strong wine. Chaimetz yayin, v'chaimetz sheichar, the vinegar of those products, lo yishta. He should not drink anything that was soaked in grapes. And he shouldn't eat grapes themselves. Next, okay, so this is very specific items, very specific prohibitions. The next verse is anything that you eat migefen hayayin, from the vine, from a wine vine. In other words, a grapevine. Okay, so that's a very generic statement. Anything that you eat from the vine. And then the Torah gives further specifications. Mechartzanim va'ad zog. Whether it's chartzan, it's the peel, or it's zag, it's the pit. So let's structure this again. The first verse says a bunch of specific items. Not wine, not vinegar, not wine, not strong wine, neither the vinegar or both of those products. No grapes, whether they're raisins or grapes. Next verse says anything that leaves the vine is prohibited. It's a generic statement. Followed by mechartzanim va'ad zog, whether it's chartzan or zog, which is a specific statement. Now, I just told you the words of generic and specific. Rabbi Eliezer would probably tell you no, it's more inclusive or less inclusive, because that's how the framework of Ribuy Umiyut works. So let's see the Gemara now. First one line is Ribuy Umiyut. Miyayin v'sheichar yazer, from wine and sheichar. That whole first pasuk is all a bunch of specific examples. Those are miyut. Those are less inclusive terms. Mikol asher yiyosem migefen yayin, from anything that leaves the vine, riba. That's a more inclusive term, and therefore it comes to add more to the category. So until the Torah begins by telling me very specific, very uninclusive terms, right? And they are yayin v'sheichar yazer, wine, vinegar, grapes, raisins. Then the Torah says, no, you have to be more inclusive category. Kol asher yosem gefen yayin, anything that's included in the category of something that leaves the vine. So that's a riba. Okay, so what do you have here? You have miyut, a less inclusive term, followed by an expansion of the category, because it's riba, it's more inclusive. When you have a more inclusive term that follows a more specific term, riba hakol, it adds to the category of basically everything. My riba, what's included by the more inclusive term, riba kol mili, everything is included. Anything that's part of a vine is included. So my miyut, but what about the fact that Torah writes a less inclusive term? It means that the most difficult to understand of the inclusive term is to be excluded. Okay, so for example, we'll say there's a few things the Torah doesn't mention. For example, the Torah doesn't mention, what about unripe grapes? It's called beiser. Often you have in a grapevine, you have these different versions of how to understand the Gemara, but you have these grapes that grow on their own, oftentimes covered by leaves, so they never get any exposed sunlight. So they never reach maturity. Again, unripe is sort of something that will become ripe eventually. This one will never ripen. That's called beni benim. Another example is you have a grape that got wormy. Obviously, you pulled out the worms because you can't consume the worms anyway. But is that included as well? Presumably, if the Torah talks about grapes, it's talking about edible grapes, not the wormy type. Okay, now comes to the tree. Like we said, there is the softer branches and the leaves. Again, the leaves, they serve them by the kiddush sometimes. And the softer branches. And you also have the firm branches, shavishta, which are very difficult to consume in the first place. It's wood basically. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer says as follows: when you have a more inclusive category, everything is included in that. Everything is included because the Torah gives a specific followed by an inclusive category. The inclusive category includes everything. But then why did the Torah give specific examples? Tell me that the least logical of all the possibilities is excluded. What's the least logical of all the possibilities? It's eating wood, basically. The branches, the zmeros. Technically, you might be able to eat some of them, but it's not really food, and therefore that's excluded. Are we together, or did I lose everybody? Okay, I guess everyone on Zoom is okay. What happened to okay? We can go again. We have time. Okay. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, what's interesting here is that this is really miyut ribuy, because the Torah does conclude with a less inclusive term, and that term is chartzanim and zag. For some reason, the Gemara in Rabbi Eliezer does not see it to be miyut ribuy. Now, perhaps the Gemara will talk about it later on. I have not seen the Gemara, and I haven't gone too far in Lamed Hey. Maybe the Gemara will talk about it later. But I'm not sure, but sort of that's an open question at this point. Okay. That's the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar basically says everything's included except for branches. Okay, what about the Rabbanan's opinion? Okay, Rabbanan Darshi Klali Uprati. The rabbis use this framework of they use the same framework they identify by the rules of Klal Uprat, which is a generic and a specific term. So what is it? From wine and strong wine, he has to refrain from drinking. Prat, that is clearly a specific term. From anything that comes from a vine, a grapevine, that's klal, that's generic term. From the peels and the pits, chozer uparat. That's another example of a specification. Prat uklal prat, iatadon elken haprat. In that scenario, you say that the prat, the specifics, categorize the rule. So what does this mean? That means it means as follows, that you take all the pratim, all the specific examples, and you try to find one category, the common denominator, the meta category that puts all those pratim into that box. So let's go through it. The Torah says pits and peels, right? Grapes, raisins, wine, vinegar. Those are all the pratim. What's the commonality between all those pratim, between all those specifics? They're all products of the fruit. They're all fruit-related products. So therefore, I'm going to say that the klal, the generic term, includes the common denominator of all the specifics. Sort of a logically, sort of intuitive. No? I'm saying it's an intuitive concept where if a Torah gives specific examples followed by a generic term, with the generic term stuck in the middle, the generic term encapsulates the specific examples. So whichever generic term you can find to put all the specifics into its box, that's the defining generic term that you're going to use. Excuse me. Okay. This the rules of this follow the rules of the prat, of the specific term. So how can we categorize the specific terms, the prat? Maha prat before it's pre upselas pre. I've called pre upselas pre. So we can explain this in more detail soon, but for now, the prat the specifics include fruit-related items, whether they're the fruit itself or whether they're pselas pre, they're the waste products of the fruit. We'll explain that shortly. Okay. So the general rule is anything that can be put in the box of fruit or the waste product of the fruit is included. The tree itself, i.e. the grape leaves, are not included. Okay. Ima prat, if that's the case, we should say, look at the specifics. Maha prat mefurish pre-gomer, afkol pre-gomer. The prat are all examples of real fruit. What does real fruit mean? Meaning that all of these were made from normal, healthy fruit, right? We have raisins and grapes, and wine and vinegar, and pits and peels, right? Presumably, the pits and peels were from healthy fruit. So the categorization should be much tighter. Instead of saying all the fruit, we should say all the healthy fruits, all the pre-gum, or all the fruit that's going to be consumed. So Mar says, you're right, but if that's the case, what remaining products do you have? Right? Grapeseed oil, by the way, is included because it's included under pits, right? Seeds. What exactly did the Torah leave out? Okay. In other words, what other examples of products from grapes that aren't included under all the? In other words, the Torah's specific terms encapsulate anything that's pre-gomer. Every product that results from a pre-gomer, a complete fruit, is included in what the Torah says. And therefore, it must be that the categorization's got to be a little bit more expansive than healthy fruit. Ripe healthy fruits. It's going to include things that even if they're not ripe healthy fruits. Because if it was just ripe, healthy fruit, which was the categorization, there's no additions that we can add to that. And then why did the Torah give you a generic term if there's nothing to add to it? Obviously, the basket that holds all the specific terms has to include other stuff as well. Please, I hope I'm doing a good job explaining here, but it's difficult. It's a difficult Gemara, so feel free to stop me if I'm losing you. Okay. Okay, 1 second. So therefore, we must use the type of expansion that adds a little bit to the basket. So in other words, something that we can put all the specifics into one category, one basket of a generic basket, and other stuff as well can be thrown in. Okay, 1 second. Okay. It's called over. Since in the end, we're going to add a lot of stuff to the list. Okay. Once we're adding things to the basket, why does the Torah need to conclude with chatzana v'adzog? In other words, say as follows. We have the first verse has 6 specifics. They are wine, strong wine, the vinegar of both products, which is 4, grapes and raisins. 6 products. All of those fit under the rubric of fruit. And obviously the rubric is going to be a little bit more expansive. Instead of saying complete healthy fruit, ripe healthy fruit, the rubric is going to be fruit, because ripe healthy fruit includes everything. In other words, ripe healthy fruit is just a description of what we already know. And obviously the klal, the expansion category, is going to include something else. So it's got to be pre-upsilas pre. It's going to have to be even including things that are questionable whether they're fruit, like unripe fruit, which never became healthy, or fruit that would never be healthy, fruit that we call bein habinim, that's the grapes that don't grow in sunlight. Okay. Now, if that's the case, so we've gotten the whole set of rules without touching chatzan and ba'adzog, the pits and the peels, which the Torah concludes with. What's that including? What's that adding? So the Gemara says to tell you as follows. Tell you as follows. Kol magam shat moitzi prat the klal yet the rishoy lemoshkul adoni ken a prat el anatz klal moisef el a prat. Asher yifim klal kosef v'dei asher por l'cha benazir. This you need to follow the following rules. If you have a klal, a generalization followed by a prat, the generalization is limited to the prat, to the specifics. If the reverse happens, you have a prat followed by a klal, first a specific, then a generalization. The generalization is moisif al haprat, so it adds everything that's included into it onto the prat. We do not say the prat, the specific, defines the klal. The only way for the prat, the specifics, to define the klal, the generalization. Let's move backwards a little bit. What does it mean for a prat to define a klal? A prat to define a klal means that you have a very generic term, anything that comes out of a vine. That can include literally anything, including the branches.
Right.
We're trying to put a box around the vine and only put some things into the box. If that's the case, then sort of we're defining the klal, we're limiting the klal. If the Torah says first a specific category, then a generic category, what we say is the generic category exists as its own, and it's in addition to the specific category. So for example, let's say Torah did not talk about chatzana and zag. I would say that these 6 things, grapes, raisins, wine, strong wine, and the vinegar of both products, is included. And additionally, even the wood of the grape is included. All of it's included. All of that's in one category. Unless the only way to say that the prat, the specific, should define the klal, the general rule is if the Torah ends with another specific, which the Torah ends in this scenario, because the Torah ends with chatzana and zag, peels and pits, which is another specific instance. And therefore we say, because the generic term is surrounded by specific instances, those instances form a rubric, generalization, a limiting feature of the klal, of the generalization. And that is, it's got to be a fruit product and not from the tree itself.
So if you say peels and pits, so you're also including seeds and skin. And
Correct. Correct. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Again. So, 750. Okay. Let's just briefly review again. Miyut and riboy is a less inclusive term and a more inclusive term. Like we pointed out yesterday, you talk about more or less inclusive. Obviously, you're talking about a gray area. There's a spectrum, obviously, and that's exactly the feature of miyut and riboy as opposed to the klal prat framework. So miyut and riboy and klal prat are existing within the same framework. They're defining it a little differently. Klal prat miyut and riboy says it's a spectrum. So therefore, even if you have a miyut followed by a riboy, a less inclusive term followed by a more inclusive term, there is going to be some limitation on that more inclusive term. That's why the Torah used a less inclusive term first. What's that limitation? Woods, right? Solid branches. In the scenario of Nazir. The rabbis, however, use the same framework, but they define it differently. They say the defining features are called klal prat. And in this scenario, we say as follows. If you have a prat, a specific, followed by a klal, the klal is in addition to the specific. And that's what we learned from Nazir. Because by Nazir, the Torah needs to include a specific, followed by a generalization, followed by another specific. Because the Torah begins and ends with specific terms and puts the generic term in the middle, we say the generic term is limited by the common denominator of all the pratim, all the specifics. Okay, and what's that common denominator? It's fruit, basically. Fruit is the common denominator. Okay, 1 second. Fruit or the waste product of the fruit. Okay. Okay, let's start the next Gemara. About 3 lines. So now the Gemara is trying to give more context, more feature to what we just learned. So Gemara repeats what we just learned. Amar Maha prat mefurish pri pselas pri. I've called pri pselas pri. Just like the specific instances the Torah gave are the fruit and its waste product. Anything that's fruit or waste product is included. Okay. When the Torah gave examples, pri of the fruit, what's an example of that? Invi, grapes, right? Grape is a fruit. Grape is the fruit from the vine. Pselas pri, waste product of the pri. What's an example of that? Mahi, what's that? Chometz, vinegar, right? Before modern winemaking, there was a lot more vinegar than there was wine. I didn't say a lot more, but it was very common to have unwanted vinegar. You know, a lot of wine ended up spoiling. Okay. So afkol, we're adding on pri pselas pri. We're adding pri, fruit plus pselas pri, waste product. What is the pri? Pri mahi, guharki, unripe. 1 second. Hold on. No. I'm sorry. We're going to Taisus here. Okay, this is a debate over here. Okay, Taisus says it's unripe, what we call boiser. I've called the pselas pri mahi. So in other words, unripe would not have been in the category. Torah doesn't talk about unripe grapes, so we include unripe grapes in the category. What's an example of a waste product? Mahi amar of kahana leisuye inve dichron. 1 second. These are grapes that got wormy grapes. So this is a waste product of grape. It's also included. The pits, what does that include as well? It includes the grapes of Ben Habinim. Ben Habinim, 1 second. Okay, yeah, there's a big debate here. Okay, 1 second. There's 2 versions here. 1 second. Yeah, okay. So until now, I was explaining to you it's the single grapes that grow under the leaves that are never exposed to sunlight. There's another version of this, which is that it is the dregs, the sediment. The nose is forbidden in that as well. Okay. That's also considered waste product. Okay, fine. We'll continue. Tomorrow we'll continue reviewing the Brisa and we'll explore this idea of klal prat and riba miyut as well. Okay. Have a good morning.